Our Father, we thank you now for your love for us, that you've given us your word as a lamp to our feet. Thank you for Jesus who came and gave his life that we might have life and have it more abundantly. We pray that as we journey through life in obedience to you, that we might demonstrate our love and commitment by our actions and attitudes. We thank you that as we process the decisions of life, you're always there, and that you do order life, but you've ordered also that we process and make decisions. So we ask that we might be wise in how we do that, that we might bathe our decisions in prayer, realizing on one hand that you do not do revelation in regard to our decisions, but that you certainly do control all of the events of life, and that we have our opportunity and responsibility to interface with your program. So we thank you now and pray that you might bless us this evening in Jesus' name. Amen. This evening we want to kind of pull things together and think about a world view and values model, something that actually we can use for the processing of decisions. We're going to look at this rather elaborate chart 2 times this evening, and we'll just take a moment now. I'm not going to do the illustrations now. I'm going to do those after I do some other things. But you'll notice that I put this chart together to try to illustrate processing. For example, at the top of the page is the issue of a decision. You have a decision that you have to make. The first decision box is the question, is it covered by a clear command? And if we have a clear command, there's no other discussion. The answer is yes, and we obey. But, of course, that's not most of our decisions, is it? The next question is it not covered by a clear command? Sometimes we may not be sure, and that unsurety could kind of go in a couple of directions. Off to the left, I have inserted the interesting illustrations of Romans and 1 Corinthians in terms of the weak and the strong, because those passages show us a lot about the process of decision-making within the body. And yet at the same time, that decision-making there is not a required moral decision other than to respect one another, but it is how believers get along when they have different opinions. So it's a little different. But by and large, we are interested in this question of knowing God's will because we don't have the answers, and we don't have what we think is a clear command. So that brings us down to this large bottom box. You could sort of think about this bottom box as your mind. Now, don't think of it as cluttered and too full of things or too confusing. But this is where our thinking process takes place. So when you have a decision that you have to make, the very first important thing is to really try to define just what is that decision. And many times it's good to try to write it down on a piece of paper. And think about it, and think about it with your loved ones and friends that are maybe a part of the decision, or people that you respect to have a conversation with. Sometimes in life, the problem is that we really don't know what the decision that we're trying to make is. We're just being too generalistic. And so it's good to try to nail what the decision is. You want to identify the values that surround the issue of the decision. Because many times, because clear commands deal with most of the moral categories, the decision that we're typically struggling with hasn't fallen under a moral command. Whom should I marry? Now, from some constructs, you've got to get a message from heaven about that. In my construct, the Bible says you are to marry a believer. But it really doesn't tell you anything else about it, does it? And yet this is an extremely life-changing and forming decision. The Bible presents it as a decision that's for life. And yet, we have lots of passages, including things like Proverbs 31, and you could reverse Proverbs 31 and make it male as well as female in sense. And we have this issue of compatibility, which is a part of marrying a believer. Asking that question, do Baptists and Presbyterians get along? You may both be believers, but what if one of you wants to go to the mission field and the other won't have anything to do with it? But we let our own emotions and infatuations overcome many times the process of reasoning in these emotional kinds of areas. But I want to make it absolutely clear that, for example, in life, once someone has decided to marry, you are now a new unit. And you can't talk about the past that we shouldn't have done this. That's out of bounds. You did. Now you move forward from that moment on as a team and as individuals that are going to process life together. I'll come back to that in a moment or two. And that's just one domain. What about being called to be a pastor? In America, because of our rugged individualism and privatization, someone who wants to be in ministry just proclaims it. But the Bible says if anyone desires the office of a bishop, it says in that text, which is an overseer, a pastor, they desire a good work. And they should fulfill certain qualifications, most of which are about character. Only one of them really is about skill sets, be apt to teach. Does that mean that they have to be a good person, but they can be pretty incompetent? No. Because there's other passages in the Bible besides 1 Timothy 3 where we could draw wisdom about what it means to be a leader. You can't just be microcosms on one passage. And so, but if you read on in that passage, it says very, very clearly that it is the church that makes the decision about whether that person's qualified or not. We are not self-called, no matter what kind of claims we make. It's the church that decides whether the person really has those gifts, doesn't have those gifts, should be in the ministry. And so this community thing becomes very important. Now, when you are processing decision, the items I have in this box are just representative items of how we ought to think in relation to a decision. For example, your own critical self-awareness. For example, we men. After we get to where we can't really play baseball too well, a man's fancy in spring turns to new car lots. Have you ever noticed that? As soon as the snow breaks, and you start hearing all the things that are wrong with your vehicle, especially if you've had it 3, 4, 5 years, and you pass these car lots, and pretty soon you're driving, and I'm just browsing. This is a good illustration of lust. Lust is the itch to get, Now, we need to have critical self-awareness that it could be cars, it could be banjos. I'm a banjo-holic, I suppose, and wanting another instrument or a different instrument, or seeking the Holy Grail, the one that actually plays and sounds right. Well, it would take another player, but, we won't worry about that. But we all have those kinds of areas in our life that we need to be aware of. I have discovered through personality tests that I tend to make decisions rather quickly, too quickly. You would think that being a teacher and dealing with a lot of information and data, that I would be very analytical and just process things to death. But I have a tendency of making my mind up rather quickly. I'm actually 0.1% of the population in Myers-Briggs. I'm really weird, and I have a way of synthesizing and in my own mind seeing where something should go, and I pretty much commit myself to that. I have to be aware of that because I have to be careful. Critical self-awareness is a huge issue in how we relate to each other, how we relate to God, how we relate to the decisions of life. If we are not critically self-aware, We can make impetuous decisions. We can not give the scriptures adequate attention. We cannot give our circumstances adequate attention. What about human obligations? Have you ever thought about this? The decisions that come to you. Let's just assume for a moment it could be the same decision. For example, buy a new vehicle. Well, if you're single and you have a good job, what's stopping you? But if you're married, you've got to process it a little differently. Maybe there's something else that's more important, a down payment on a home, or to pay the debt down that we have, things like that. But when you're married and you have children, it starts getting more complicated, doesn't it? Now, I want you to realize that if you study the Bible presents values for all of these various situations. It talks about being single. It talks about being married. It talks about being married with children. It talks about when the kids have left and the parents arrive. You see, there are sets of values for all of the phases of life that we find ourselves in. And those do affect godly decision making. We have to take into consideration what the Bible says about these things. So the way we make decisions changes with the changing seasons of life. Circumstantial providence. I put a lot of weight in this because this is where God's sovereignty operates. You can't fight City Hall, for example. You know, we have that cliche. And I think that we need to be sensitive, and that has all kinds of ramifications. For example, for myself as a teacher, I haven't written as much as I would like. In fact, I haven't written very much at all for my guild. And I've spent most of my time teaching, public speaking, and those sorts of things. And the interesting thing about writing is that I'm never done reading, never done researching. And I to pull the plug on that and go ahead and say it is a very difficult thing for me to do. Now, that's critical self-awareness. But circumstantial providence also says that I was born into a family. I have a certain genetic code. I do not have a photographic memory. I don't remember things as easily as some of my colleagues. Some of my colleagues can close their eyes and read the book, you know. And it takes me, I have a different way of concentrating. I can't concentrate for 1 hour in the midst of a busy day and get something like writing accomplished. It takes me 2 hours to get warmed up and to reread and to think. And then those later hours. So I need big blocks of time to be able to do that. And so circumstantial providence has to do with who I am as a person. And that has ramifications about what I can achieve in life, even when I work hard. The Puritans were pretty good at this. They had a deep level of trust in the sovereignty and providence of God. And they would try a business venture, but if it failed, they didn't feel bad if they did their best because they just accept it as God's providence. James talks about this. You can't say what you're going to do. Say, if the Lord wills, I'll be successful, or I won't be successful. And that Lord's will in that particular passage has mostly to do about God's sovereignty and providence. You could be the smartest person in the world and the best person for that thing in the world and still fail. In fact, most of the people who have been quite successful in life failed several times before they hit it. Every story you read has that same sort of a scenario. And that's hard to accept when we're in the midst of it. But it's a very true fact of life. Circumstantial providence. One time I was leaving a school and going and was looking for a job. And nothing was really happening. I'd sent my resume out and no phone calls, pounding on the doors, making the connections, nothing really happening. Then I got one opportunity. I checked it out. It was a good fit, not a total fit, but it was something I could commit myself to for long term, and it was in the area of my calling, so I made a decision to go. The next day I got 4 phone calls. with things I might have liked to do better. But I'd made a commitment, and a formal kind of a commitment. I view that as a bit of circumstantial providence. And so I kept that commitment. But interestingly, that situation didn't last a long time. I came from Pennsylvania to here. I was only there for a couple of years. It was a great 2 years. In fact, about 13 students came here to seminary as a result of being out there. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. But the fact is that it wasn't long term. In fact, when I made the decision to leave there, the circumstances were quite different, but it was still very clear, and I believe it was the appropriate thing in hindsight. Now, sometimes we make a decision and we get into it and we realize it's not working, and other people think it's not working, and we have to make a change. And hindsight says that I probably didn't make the best decision. But, I learned something from not making the best decision. God builds his work sometimes on our bad decisions. And we grow and maturate as a result of that. If we had a system that didn't allow for that, we would not develop as people like we're supposed to develop. So failure is a very important part of life, as well as success. Circumstantial providence has many tentacles. And sometimes it has to do with timing. Sometimes it has to do with our own skills. Sometimes it has to do with what church we're in. And we always think the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. A young man said something one time when he was looking for a church that was quite wise beyond his age, and it was this: I'm not looking for a perfect church. I'm looking for one that has problems with which I can deal. That was very wise. And we go through these phases of life, and I think that God takes us through these phases. That's his job, his providence, to take us through the phases as we demonstrate our faithfulness, obedience, and decision-making. And he molds us so that eventually the moment comes for that 15 minutes, you might say, that really makes a difference. And who knows when that's coming and when it's going to happen and how it's going to happen. Researched opinion about your current issue is very important, and I'll illustrate some of these a little more later. Your theological tradition and understandings. Each of you here have chosen more or less to operate within a certain theological understanding, a certain church that has certain belief systems. Now, those should always be reviewed and tested, but sometimes you might even change your view on something that is not a major issue within that church. But you don't leave the church because of that. You don't make waves because of it. You don't try to change everyone else. So there's this issue of your theological traditions and understandings that are quite important. Your role and personal obligations in God's kingdom. These are things that are our personal convictions. For myself, and I was in the Navy, felt that I was called into full-time vocational Christian service. I went to school. As I was in school, I decided maybe this isn't what I want to do. So I tried to talk myself out of it. But I felt like an idiot because deep down inside, I knew that I was resisting the very thing that I should be embracing. Now, sometimes we embrace things for a time and not forever in terms of the things that we do in life. There's various answers to that. The average male in the United States changes careers about 3 times in their lifetime. In fact, the stats may even be higher now than the last time I heard it. Now, is that God's will, or is that what happens within our culture that we have to deal with because we are subjects many times of our own culture? Well, it's God's will that whatever we do within our culture, we do it to his glory and within the boundaries of his teaching. We live in the backyard. It's a nice imagery to think of that God has given us a yard with a fence. And he has given us the freedom, this is an important piece, the freedom to operate within a yard. We can be up the tree, we can play in the sand, we can ride our bike, we can play baseball, but don't go over the fence. Stay in the yard. Those are the boundaries. And I think that moving through life and making decisions, God has set those kinds of boundaries. The yard is his moral will and his clear teachings. Internal to the yard, various issues come up from time to time. If on one week 1,000 cats just went through the yard, I wouldn't play in the sand. Okay? Or if there's a lightning storm, I'd stay away from the tree. And so this, in a sense, I think is why God created us in his image. We are created in the image of God, and we glorify God by our process of struggling with the decisions of life in certain boundaries. You do the same. Look at how God has made parents and children. The role of a parent is to create boundaries. The children don't always like those boundaries. But you create the boundaries, and you let the boundaries be relatively wide. If they won't listen to you about the stove being hot, then they're going to have to learn on their own. But they'll do it once and they won't do it again. And so that very way that creation is set up ought to teach us a little something. God is our Father and we are his children. And he deals with us in many ways, like parents deal with children. There are boundaries. We have freedom within boundaries. But when we violate the boundaries, that's when we are out of God's will. We may be up the tree during a storm. But if we're within the boundaries, we're not out of God's will, we're just doing something stupid. We'll learn not to do that again. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity not to do it again. But we grow and we maturate as a result of that. But even inside of the yard, God is at work. You'll notice around this square box at the bottom, I have that statement, carried out with an attitude of prayer for discerning wisdom. That's not prayer for revelation. It's for wisdom. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask from God. And if you take the context of James 1, wisdom in that context is about trials and temptation. I need wisdom to know why bad things happen to good people. And that calls for a deep level of worldview and values understanding. To have that wisdom. The Bible can give us that wisdom. And an attitude of submission to God's sovereignty and providence. I do my responsibility. God takes care of the rest. In fact, there are texts, even in the Old Testament, that the things that are revealed belong to us, but the secret things belong to God. But we are always trying to break that barrier because we feel if we can, we'll be safer. But the safest approach to life is to love God and to love your neighbor and to proceed through life in a way that is consciously, self-critically trying to be obedient to what you believe God teaches. And he will order many of the events of life in ways that we could not have manipulated ourselves. That's God's involvement. So this role in personal obligations, our own desires. Don't reject your desires. Have you ever heard anyone say, "Oh, I'll never go to the New Hebrides to be a missionary"? And then they say, "Oh my, I shouldn't have said that. Now God's going to make me go." That was very popular illustration decades ago, I suppose, and maybe it still is. Listen, that's not the kind of God I know. That's not the way God operates. The Psalms say over and over and over and over and over again, he will give you the desires of your heart. And the heart is what? The rational processing of life. Now those are within the boundaries. Every good thing is available to us. But not every good thing is appropriate at a given moment in life. So we have desires. We shouldn't squelch those desires. We should go for the gold. But if we get only the bronze and realize that we really are not a gold person, we should hug that bronze and make the best of it and keep it polished as best we can. That is living under the kingdom rule of God. The Council of Informed People and Friends, the reprint, I noticed there's a tab that's not right there. The Council of Informed People and Friends. You know, when I think back over my life, I was given a lot of good information. I was given a lot of good advice by my dad, who wasn't even a believer. He believed in Jesus on one hand, but he was not a church man. He read the Bible all the time. He gave me a lot of good advice. And there were other individuals at, not too many, but a few in life who gave me good advice. I didn't listen to any of them. You know, you're probably dealing with some children or young people sometimes this way. You know you could really help them and point them off into the right way. And you think, and you even are careful about how you tell them and try to give them advice, and they don't listen anyway. You know, I think there's something about life that there's something about us as human beings that we seem to be incapable of taking good advice. We're going to do it our way. They're going to fail, and we're going to back up and punt. But occasionally, someone comes through who has the humility, the understanding that perhaps some of these folks that have been down that road do know a little more, and I should listen more carefully to it and then make my decisions. The views and approval of the community to whom you answer. What do other people think about you and your processing and your thinking? In the book, I do have a number of illustrations in these areas. And I'll come back to a couple of them later. I don't want to get out of kilter. Let me move on to the next slide. We'll come back to this one as I build a little more territory here. Now, we've talked a lot about worldview and values, and I want to talk to you a little bit about Lot. Because Lot is the best example I know, a classic illustration of wrong values and conflict. Now, I mentioned to you previously, just in passing, that if we didn't have 2 Peter about Lot, then we wouldn't really realize that Lot was a believer. It's 2 Peter that convinces us of that. Turn over for a moment to 2 Peter and chapter 2 and verses 7 and 8. I don't have that cited in the slide there. 2 Peter chapter 2 and verses 7 and 8. Back in verse 4, for if God did not spare the angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, committed them to chains of deepest darkness to keep under the judgment, until the judgment. And if he did not spare the ancient world, that's the flood, even though he saved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood on the world of the ungodly. And if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes, he condemned them to extinction, and made them an example of what is coming to the ungodly. And if he rescued Lot. Now this is fascinating. Peter is explaining to us the inner workings of the mind of Lot in this passage. He said, Lot's a righteous man, which, you know, I never really got that out of the Old Testament. He says, he's going to say it 3 times. He's a righteous man. Then it says he's greatly distressed by the licentiousness of the lawless. That greatly distressed is an interesting term that has to do with, if it's like being in a police station. You're guilty, the light's on you, but you're going to do everything you can not to confess. You're sweating. You're nervous. You're trying not to slip up. Tell the story the same way every time. Now, I'm going to try to illustrate to you why this says that in a moment. Greatly distressed by the licentiousness of the lawless. For that righteous man, there's a second time, living among them day after day, was tormented. Here's another term. There's these 2 terms, greatly distressed and tormented, the way the NRSV translates them, that have to do with the inner consciousness of Lot in the midst of his activities and life in the city of Sodom What was going on with Lot? He was tormented in his righteous soul. There's the third thing. By their lawless deeds that he saw and heard. Now let's rehearse just for a moment. With Peter's giving us this understanding of the internal struggle of Lot, back into Genesis chapter 12 through 19, where we have this account and narrative within the Abrahamic narrative of the situation with Lot. Just think a little bit about it. You know the story, so I can rehearse this without laboring it. Abram was called out of the Ur of the Chaldees, which we really don't know where it is. Most of your maps have put it down in southern Mesopotamia. But remember, if there was a universal flood previous to some of these things may not be located in the same places we're thinking of. Most think that this place where Abraham lived was up in the northern part of Mesopotamia, most ancient Near Eastern scholars. And Terah is the father. Haran is one of his brothers. Haran dies before the father. And then it seems that Lot shifted to the family of Abram to be cared for, because we have these household setups in the ancient world. That's true in Israel. It's true even in the first century. No single family homes, really, besides the issue of servants and other things of that nature. They were large households, sort of like, they're probably not too far from the way the Bedouins live in some of the desert areas of the ancient Near East today. They have their households and they stick together generation after generation. Well, but Abram is called. In fact, some of this is talked about at the end of the book of Joshua. He was called from beyond the river, reflecting later when they're in the land of Canaan to where Abram came from. He was not, this is where Abram is the origination of Jews. He's the start of this thing. And out of all of those ancient pagans, God chose Abram and communicated to him the only way that he could. There was obviously no Bible. There was nothing that Abram could study to get to Yahweh. Yahweh appeared to him. And he did this over and over, but over a long period of time. Sometimes there's decades between God's appearing in the book of Genesis. There may only be a chapter or two, but the chronological situation may flesh out to be decades before God appeared again and gave more information. Abram took in this information and became a deposit of that information. Now, of course, he was passing that information on to his family. So Lot would have received that information. He would have been told about God's expectations to the extent that Abram had that knowledge. And Abram himself lived on those expectations until he got another message. Look at Abram's struggle about having a child. He got the promise, and then he didn't get any more information. He didn't get any more encouragement. He just had the word, and he tried to figure it out on his own. He did it in the way an ancient Near Eastern person would do it. That was not unusual, even though we see it different today in terms of our moral standards. But that was not unusual in the context of Abram to have his maidservant. And Ishmael's born, and now look at the mess we're in. But nonetheless, Abram only had that information. But what he had, he passed on to Lot. He took Lot in as an apprentice in husbandry, raising cattle and sheep, and they were herdsmen. And in the ancient world, they had to move around to find the grass. So when it dried up in one area, they went to another area. They were nomadic in that regard. That's why they had to go down to Egypt on occasion. They had to keep this household with all of its paraphernalia surviving. And so they did move around. Lot learned some other things too, didn't he? Remember the account of Abram telling Sarah? Her name was changed as well, of course. Say you're my sister. You're a good-looking woman. When Pharaoh sees you, he'll want to have you. Now, in the ancient world, marriages were political alliances. That's why Solomon had so many wives, because he had political alliances with the various tribes and nations. This was a way of managing kingdoms in the ancient world. And he did have children by them too, because that made it even more serious, because those other nations are going to be careful about killing their own. So that was a very common situation in the ancient Near East. And so Abram's going to protect himself, but he lies. Now, we don't have the Ten Commandments yet. But I kind of have a feeling that God has taught Abram to be truthful. Abram didn't give us the data that he had. And here's Lot watching. Hey, that was pretty tricky. That's pretty tricky. I learned something today. I'm going to make a decision for number one. I'm going to be self-protective. And we know that that decision turned sour. God protected Abram from being killed by a greater power. But it's a fascinating narrative there about Abram and Pharaoh. But one day in chapter 13, the herds, Genesis 13, the herds of Abram and the herds of Lot became so large they could no longer coexist. The grass wasn't enough. They needed to go in different directions. I think Abram had grown up just a little bit when that time came. Look at verse 8. You don't have to look. You can look or listen. Genesis 13:8. Then Abram said to Lot, after this situation had arisen of being too crowded and problems arising, let there be no strife between you and me, between your herders and my herders, for we're kin. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left, I'll go to the right. You take the right, I'll go to the left. That's some maturity. Abram's not looking out after number one any longer in that decision-making process. But he's actually putting himself, in some sense, in jeopardy. What if Lot would have said, get out of Canaan? You go to Sodom. There was nothing to say what Lot would have chosen. But what did Lot do? I want you to notice this now in verse 10. Lot looked about him and saw that the plain of the Jordan was well what? Well watered. What's that going to take care of? My herds. Like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other, Abraham in Canaan, and Lot settled among the cities of the plain, moved his tent as far as Sodom. Then we have an editorial statement by the writer of Genesis. In verse 13 it says this, now the people of Sodom were wicked and great sinners against the Lord. And then the very next thing in verse 14, God reappears to Abram, and Lot missed that appearance and the information that came from it. Now, why did Lot choose Sodom? He chose it on the basis of his values, which were, feed my sheep. But what about your kids? Lot wasn't naive about the nature of those cities, but he took his family into that context for one thing and one thing alone, to be more successful in his business. Now, what happened when he got there? Well, another interesting thing that comes up later that tells us a world of things is in chapter 19, when, after many of these other narrative pieces, and remember, God goes as the angel of the Lord to Abram, says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abram says, what if there's just 10 righteous? You know, he negotiates God down to 10 and never even gets that. And then the two others who are just regular angels who look like men went on to Sodom. And they're coming in chapter 19, verse 1. And the two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. Now that may seem sort of incidental, like two good old boys down at the corner store drinking an RC Cola and eating a moon pie. Now, if you've been to Carolina, they have such things, okay? That's not what being in the gate means. In the ancient Near East, for a person to be in the gate is a technical phrase that means they are part of the city politics. They're the elders. Boaz had to go to the elders in the gate in relation to his situation. It comes up over and over and over again. It's very, very well established. So now we have Lot, who has over these years fully integrated into the city. So much so, I'll go as far to say that he's now a judge on the court of Sodom, because it was the elders of the city in the gate that adjudicated the issues and the complaints and the charges that people brought against each other. So here he is sitting on the bench. And every day, decisions were brought in front of him that bothered his conscience, that violated the values that he had learned. Now, remember, Peter told us he's a believer. He had the right values, he just wouldn't own them because of his context. Every day, paraded in front of him, he had to make decisions that satisfied the council, that reflected the values of Sodom, and it was tearing him up on the inside. Peter says he was distressed and he was tormented. The only illustration I can think is a judge under mafia control. He was a good man at one time. But now he's no longer that way because he's afraid to do what is right. He knows what is right, but he doesn't have the courage to pursue it. Lot is absolutely in conflict and in tension. I have a sermon on this passage. I call it How to Live a Miserable Life. That's what a Christian wants to hear on Sunday morning, right? How to live a miserable life. Violate your values, and you'll be miserable until you get to where you cauterize your conscience so much that your values are gone. You know, we know about lie detectors, but people who are trained to interrogate also know about eyeballs. Are you aware that a person, when they lie, their eye dilates? The less they lie, the more it dilates. The more they lie as a pattern, the less it dilates. Pathological liars can lie and never indicate it in their eyes. I don't understand that, but I know that, and I've been told by people who are in a position to know, that that is a fact. Our own body sends messages. Remember on TV they talk about winking or blinking your eyes, remember? This has not been too long ago, where they were talking about someone who's being interviewed. Did you do it? No. And yeah, a lot of us blink because of nervousness. But there's another feature, but the eyeball doesn't lie. Well, here's Lot. He's distressed, he's tormented. For what reason? The values that he had received, he can't live by in his context. And he's all torn up. When those two men came, what did Lot do? He grabbed them before anybody else. He was hoping nobody knew they had come to town. It's about sundown. It's like being downtown in L.A. when the sun goes down. If you've never been there, you won't understand what I'm saying. Out of the crevices, all kinds of things come. And the sun's going down. He grabs them and he takes them home. The city comes to his door. They wanted to know them, and that's not asking for ID. He offered his daughters. Good night. Even though the laws of hospitality made him obligated to protect these men at all costs, he offers his daughters to the crowd. But that doesn't satisfy. Where has Lot gone in his life? It's all about values. And even though he didn't have a Bible, he had enough information through Abram to live right. And even that information was getting trampled upon. But because he was a believer, he couldn't get away from it on his insides. Absolutely tortured and tormented was Lot. What a classic illustration. That our decision-making processes need to be driven and be consistent with our values. Now, when we talk about conscience, we're going to talk about some interesting things. Could a person value something and be wrong? Yes. So there's something that there's another process on top of all this. To be transformed by the renewing of your mind means that on occasion you're going to be adjusting your values as you learn more about God and about God's teaching and about God's ways in the world. All of us go through this. This is part of maturation. I have an illustration in the book about when I was a teenager. I used to go down, skip school, and go to a couple of pool halls where my uncles used to play pool, drink, and gamble. I thought that was really cool as a teen, almost not quite a teenager, but right at the edge of being a teenager in a small factory town in Indiana. And so when I became a Christian, I was in New London, Connecticut, and in Groton, and I went over to New London because there was a Christian Servicemen Center there. I was told, I had just been saved a few weeks, and I was told that I should go to the Servicemen Center because they would help me to grow in my new faith. Well, I went. I was about halfway up the stairs when I heard a familiar sound. Billiard balls, nothing like it. I said to myself, "Self, this is not the right place." Because the only thing I thought about when I thought about pool was the Black Cat and the Mecca, which were the two bars on 5th Street in Indiana. So I went down, I checked. Yeah, this is the place. There's the sign. I went upstairs, and they had 2 or 3 pool tables with sailors who were around playing pool. And I tell you, I felt awful. I was in the wrong place. Why? Because out of my context, my own worldview and values about pool was anything but Christian. It contradicted being Christian. But it took a long, long time for me to be able to play pool without feeling bad. Because it took a long time for my internal processing to realize it's not the pool table, it's where it is. It's what you do with it. Long time to be able to make that transition. So we're all in process in certain ways. And the only way we can do that process is by the continual growth in the grace and knowledge of our Lord through His Word. Now in chapter 7, I talk about Bob, becoming an adult decision maker. You've seen the movie What About Bob, I'm sure. If you haven't, you must. That's one of the best little movies you'll ever see. It's about a pathological person who can't make a decision about anything unless the doctor holds his hand. Now, what about this Bob? Well, guidance is personal, but it's not privatized, is one of the points that I try to make. Life is not about me, myself, and I. It's not about you. In the kingdom, life is about the kingdom. It's about the church. We are a community. That is not common for us. It's not natural for us in an American society because we are taught from the day we're born to be rugged individualists, to be that my personal freedom is the most important thing on the face of the earth. And that I am my own boundaries. And I have at the end of the day, I look out after myself. Now that is so contrary to the whole concept of God's kingdom and of the church. Guidance is personal, but not privatized. Within the midst of our community, God moves us, alters us, gets us into the right slots if we will just follow, be obedient, faithful, and make an effort. Get involved. In fact, the interesting thing about the gifts in Corinthians and particularly in Corinthians, there's only 4 places in the New Testament where there's gift lists, only 4. 2 of them are in Corinthians, and they're problems. But the whole point about the gifts is that gifts emerge within the body in the midst of our activity. It's not that you find it and then go do it. It's that it emerges as God uses us as individuals within the community. So if you want to know God's will about your giftedness, get busy. And that will happen. That will develop. But if you retreat and say, well, God hasn't told me to do that yet. Usually it's something the Bible's already told us to do, to witness, to teach, to pray, to support, to da, 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 da. It's usually there. But we're waiting for our specific word. No. You get busy. And as you do within the community, you emerge as the individual who has been gifted by God, sometimes naturally, in the early church even supernaturally, to do a certain task within the body. So it's not about me, myself, and I. In our culture, I think that people are under the assumption of that the most important thing as a Christian is what Jesus means to me. My personal devotional relationship with Jesus. I got bad news for you. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about God's work in the world. I'm more concerned with what Jesus meant for the purpose of living according to his will than I am about what Jesus means to me. Now, I don't know if you get that point, but I think that we have been so conditioned to this private, personal, me, myself, and I kind of an agenda that we transfer that over into Christianity. It's all about me, what Jesus means to me. I want to be happy. And so we order even our worship services to make us happy rather than to educate us. So it's personal, but not private. It's not all about me. Also, we need to take responsibility for our actions and decisions. Bob didn't do that very well. And we move from revelation. As Christians, we have the revelation of the Bible. We move from that to discernment. Now, this next slide kind of illustrates this. I'm ahead of the slides here. God's will is godly discernment. I really believe that that's where the Bible is going with all this. We've seen the old, we've seen the new, we've seen that we have the moral and the sovereign will of God. But we have not found the evidence that we've got to find out the future in order to be able to make a decision about it. That's not a model. And yet it is a stereotype that often exists. God's will has been revealed. His moral will and his sovereign will. The sovereign will, of course, is not revealed, but is a revealed fact that we see after the fact. Furthermore, from the sovereign and moral will, godly discernment proceeds as we order life according to God's teachings. Then God's will is applied. We don't have a proof text in the Bible that says, do not beat your spouse. But the Bible screams values that says that's wrong. It's disrespectful of a person. It's a lack of love. It's not moving in the right direction in life. So discernment comes through this process of God's will applied. One of the interesting things that I've noticed over the last few years is this, is that love is the biggest theme in the Bible. It's a model for discernment, and it's a model that moves beyond proof text. The Bible says love. It gives us the command to love. Love one another. Well, what do you mean? Where's the list? Does that mean that I go to the grocery store instead of my wife, or I do the dishes instead of my wife? What is love? The Bible commands it, but doesn't give us the list. What's the great commandment? To love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. That's true in the Old Testament, and it is repeated in the New Testament in many ways. Think about Galatians 5 and 6 for a moment. One of the most familiar passages, probably to many of us, is this passage about the fruit of the Spirit. But what's that about? Would you turn to Galatians just for a moment as we try to bring this together a little bit? Galatians chapter 5. I want to show you something that's, I think, very essential to unpacking this issue of the fruit of the Spirit, and yet I find it missed consistently. For example, in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13, you were called to freedom, brothers and sisters, but don't use your freedom as an opportunity for self-indulgence. But through what? Love becomes servants to one another. For the whole law is summed up in a single commandment. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. What's missing, by the way? Love God. It's not here in the context. That's not very spiritual, is it? I think the point that Paul was making is this. If you can't demonstrate on the horizontal level your love for one another, there's no reason to believe when you assert it on the vertical level. You say you love God, prove it. Jesus said, and John records, if you love me, what? Keep my commandments. Love one another. Be devoted to one another. Now, I want to show you something. The whole law was fulfilled. Love your neighbor as yourself. That's Mosaic, actually. But look over in chapter 6. In verse 2, bear one another's burdens, which I think is a variation on what love really is, stepping in that way. And in this way you will fulfill what? The law of Christ. See, this text is bounded by law in two ways. Love your neighbor as yourself, and love your neighbor by bearing one another's burdens. And that, of course, is in the community. What's in between these pieces of bread, as if you please? There are two things. There's the fruit of the Spirit and the works of the flesh. Many times we read love, joy, peace, gentleness, meekness, and all that, and we think about it as me, myself, and I. That this is God's love for me. This is the peace that God gives me because I know Him, and so forth. I don't think that's the way we should be reading those verses. The fruit of the Spirit is in a context of of exposing what it means to love your neighbor. To promote love, to promote joy, to promote peace. Think of Euodias and Syntyche. Philippians 4. Euodias and Syntyche were out of sorts with each other, causing problems in the church. Paul says, get your act together. And immediately after that, he gives a staccato list of things, and verse 7 says, and the peace of God shall guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Peace is a product in that passage of Euodias and Syntyche getting themselves together. You see, peace is a barometer of the health of the community. If the community comes together and there's persons in the community sitting in various places in the congregation that hate each other, and they're not going to sit on the same pew for sure, they're not going to shake each other's hands. If they go out the front door, the other one goes out the back door. The fruit of the Spirit is really a list of words that are supposed to order the atmosphere and attitudes and behavior within the church. But the problem is this. These words need to be defined. Actually, they need to be described. Can you draw a picture on the whiteboard of love? What would you draw? A heart? Mother? What about, draw me a picture of joy. Can't do it. Draw me a picture of peace. See, these are what we call technically logical constructs. They're words that capture a whole world of meaning. Love is the determination to do good, the greatest possible good toward the object loved. But how do you define what is good? We're back to our circle again, you see. You define what is good by understanding what the Scriptures teach in how we should live, how we should behave, what our attitudes should be. Love has been given as the mode of operation for Israel and for the church. So it has got to be a concept that's not passive, but active. Love, move toward one another with their best interest in view is what it's about. So the fruit of the Spirit. Now, you may have trouble getting your arms around that immediately. It may sound a little different. You're trying to say, how do I think about that? Well, think about it from the other angle, the works of the flesh. You don't have any trouble understanding what they are. You can fill in the blanks on those. And if you'll think about them for a moment, none of them can operate with me, myself, and I. It takes a community to make those things operable. The fruit of the Spirit is exactly the same way if you understand it correctly. They're a barometer of activity in the community as we move toward one another. That's God's will, that the community live that way and not live the other way. Most of the works of the flesh are violations of people. You violate them by envy, by strife, by sexual licentiousness, by anger. That's striking out against the community rather than loving the community, promoting joy, promoting peace, promoting long-suffering and faithfulness, kindness, gentleness, meekness, and so forth. It's a fascinating piece to think about the fact that the pursuit of God's will comes down to the great commandment, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I have a lot more to say, and I didn't get to where I want. I'm going to actually start on the chart next time, which will be not next Thursday, but 2 weeks from today. I'll be out of town, on the way out of town next Thursday. So if you don't have the schedule, there's one on the table back there so that you don't forget that. So 2 weeks from today, we'll come back and we'll have our next session, and I'll start with the chart and talk a little more about the issue of decision making in this reflective sort of a way. Thank you, and have a good evening.